Hello. We are going to go ahead and get started. I assume others will be joining us. Actually, I'm going to take a quick look at email. Okay, make sure nobody's stranded somewhere. Okay, we're good. Welcome to the webinar today, Business Arc 201. We are starting a series. We are starting with session 1 today. I just want to remind those who are joining us that you should have, well, you shouldn't have, you don't have to have, but because this is a 201 series, it indicates that having a background in business architecture would probably make this particular session more meaningful to you. But of course, everyone is welcome. So don't feel like you have to go if that's not your thing. We just wanted to clarify that. The second thing that I would like to clarify is that the session today is being recorded, just so you're not caught off guard by that. And so you can see on the screen that I have Kit Shelton with me today. She is our featured expert. Kit, I didn't, you'll have to tell them your official role or it's on the website, but Kit is in business architecture for the DHS, Department of Human Services at Minnesota. Oh, and actually, see, it's summertime. You know how you kind of, in Minnesota, we're not always at our best in summertime. I'm Beth Schaefer. I'm the director of the Institute for Professional Development at Metro State. So I probably should have led with that. All right. So you know who I am and you know who Kit is. Kit and I are both fortunate enough to do business architecture work here in Minnesota, which has, I think, one of the most active business architecture communities in the nation, really. And so Kit and I have crossed paths several times over the last 5-6 years, I'm going to say, through the Twin Cities Business Architecture Forum, through the MinGov, and through Kit is an alumni of our business architecture certificate program here at Metro State. And so chicken, egg, I'm not sure which of those things came first and in which order, but Kit and I have been hanging out together in the business architecture space for a while now. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you, and did my slide advance there, Kit? Okay, thank you. All right. So I've mentioned the MinGov Business Architecture Community of Practice. So this is a free, I should say, support group, which doesn't sound quite right, but yet when you do business architecture, that may be the exact right term that we use for this group. So this group meets mostly monthly to have conversations about business architecture. You do need to be an employee of a city, county, or state agency in Minnesota. And our reason for that is that a lot of times government workers, we kind of get a bad rap sometimes for, government work. So we need a safe space to discuss what we're doing and where we don't want, I guess, the wrong information to get out about what government is up to or what we're doing in the business architecture space. Not that it's covert, but that, as all of you know, business architecture is not an exact science. So we get together and discuss kind of the unique aspects of doing business architecture in public sector. But if you are in one of those roles and you wish to join us, simply send me an email and I will pass along your name and where you work to the organizer of the group. She'll verify that that's the case, and then she'll just put you on the team's invite list for those monthly meetings and you can join us. It's a very informal group. Sometimes we have a planned guest speaker. Sometimes it's one of us presenting on a topic. Last month, I think somebody asked one question at the start and we talked about it for the entire time. So it can be some interesting discussion. The other place that Kit and I are connected from is from Metro State's Business Architect Certificate. We will be, it is a guild approved, a business architecture guild approved program. And we will be starting a new virtual session, so attending all through Zoom this winter, which is a good time to do virtual things in Minnesota. It's 15 nights, 5 to 8 p.m. January through March. I am still working with the instructors to finalize the exact dates. Our instructors are actual business architects working in the field. So they're not just academic lecturers, they're just like you. Except they've maybe been doing business architecture longer. So that is coming up. And then I think that is it for me, Kit. I am going to stop sharing. Actually, one last logistical thing I see in my notes. Because we are in webinar format today for Zoom, I don't know if the chat is enabled or not, but the Q&A, you should have a Q&A bubble feature on the bottom in your controls. So if you have a question for Kit today, there's two ways you can ask. You can type your question into the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that and try to appropriately interrupt at the right spot for that question to time out with what Kit is saying. Or if it's kind of a long question and you don't want to type it out, you can just send me a message in Q&A and say, I have a question, and I can unmute you, and then you can talk. If you send us questions, or if Kit asks for responses to type into Q&A, you can do that anonymously. We won't reveal who you are. The only time you'll be revealed is if you choose to unmute and ask a question. So I think that's all the logistics. Now I will stop sharing, and that should allow you to share.
Great. There we go.
Good. All right, and I will fade into the background, Kit.
Thank you so much, Beth. Hi, everybody. My name is Kit. I work as an enterprise business architect at the Department of Human Services, and I'm excited to be participating in Metro State's program. So Beth and I connected a while back. As she mentioned, I took the certificate course that Metro State offers. And as we kept on running into each other at business architecture conferences and forums, we commiserated around how much of the content around business architecture tends to focus on a for-profit perspective. My own background is actually in corporate. I worked for over a decade at Whole Foods Market, where I started out as a bulk buyer and kind of worked my way up through team leadership and store leadership until I joined the global finance team as an internal consultant and a strategic business analyst. At some point in there, I learned the term business architecture for what we do, and then never really connected with the broader community until I left Whole Foods and realized that I needed to learn some industry language to be able to transfer what I'd learned there to other industries or organizations. So a big passion that I have is growing awareness of this fascinating tool. It can really help with a lot of things that are currently frustrating about government. So the more the merrier, in my opinion. I'd also like to demonstrate how we're using business architecture to transform our operating model. The idea of a product operating model has been a hot topic in a lot of business architecture communities lately, and I want to share what we're doing and hopefully get feedback, inspire some people, get challenged, learn how to do it better. I like to be part of a community. So the series, we're going to do 3 courses. Today's, we're going to mostly focus on an overview of the framework that we use for business architecture at DHS, and then dive into the capability domain, because there's a difference of approaches around capabilities. And I'd like to be clear about how we're using the BizBox standards to work with them. Next time in October, we're going to dig a little bit more into the value domain to show how we're using architectural value streams to center the perspective of the people we serve as we analyze and organize our business. And lastly, in December, we're going to show how those two core domains come together to form the business architecture baseline that we're using to support structuring a product taxonomy to enable our operating model transformation. So today we're focusing in specifically on capabilities. First, I'm going to try to enrich understanding of the 10 domain approach to business architecture in a context of a state public service function. I'm going to try to clarify the role of capabilities within that 10 domain approach to business architecture, and then demonstrate the use of information by a specific capability instance at the Department of Human Services to illustrate the concepts that we're covering. So let's dive in. On my screen right now is the 10 domain framework of business architecture. One of the main advocates for this framework is the Business Architecture Guild. They're a nonprofit industry association group for practicing business architects. They also maintain the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge, affectionately known as the BizBach, and that is created and maintained by practicing business architects, members of the Guild, volunteering their time. Disclosures, I've myself been a member of the Guild since 2020. When I mentioned earlier, when I left Whole Foods, I needed to tap into the community to learn how people talk about the discipline outside of the jargon that we used at Whole Foods. One thing that I've learned about business architecture is that the terms in use are the terms of the business. And so we have to be able to translate language from the way that any organization talks about themselves into these broader concepts that help us organize our thinking about it and organize the information of a business too. So I really liked about what I saw in the BizBach and from the Guild that it's pretty approachable for an individual. I paid $125 to have access to everything that membership grants, white papers, the BizBach, etc. And through those resources, learned the terminology that helped me understand how to talk to other people who do what I do. So the scope of business architecture is the scope of the business. These 10 domains represent the business scope of an organization, and they work whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, or a public sector function, like where I work now. Each one of these 10 domains offers a different perspective of the organization. And as a business architect, it's not our job to know everything about all of them. It's our job to understand how they work together and to coordinate with subject matter experts throughout the organization to create blueprints that show the details that are critical to each domain and to map how they fit in with the others. And we're going to be mostly focusing on the inner wheel. You see this is divided into two sections. The four in the center are considered the core domains of business architecture. And that's organization, information, capabilities, and value streams. There's also the extended domains that are critical to understanding more about how the organization works. And they are also more changeable over time. So simply put, an organization uses information to perform capabilities that create value. That represents the four core domains, which make up the most stable aspects of a business, the structures of an organization that change the least over time. Focusing on the core domains and focusing on the core domains and mapping the extended domains through real-life applications driven by work you do at the core is a good place for most practices to start. So in the context of a public sector function, the mission of the Minnesota Department of Human Services is that, working with many others, we help people meet their basic needs so they can live in dignity and achieve their highest potential. So our core mission is to help people get their basic needs met. We oversee free and low-cost healthcare, food assistance, substance abuse intervention, child protection, foster care, adoption, elder care, child care, and more. We don't make revenue from these services being delivered. Our funding comes from policy, mostly from budgets set by legislators at the federal and state levels for states to provide human services, with accompanying policy about how each of those funds can and cannot be used. We operate as a clearinghouse for all of those programs, both federal and state. Critical to our mission is working with many others. The business model for the human service system of Minnesota involves counties and tribal nations heavily. We have 87 counties and 11 tribal nations that we work with throughout the state. They are the local connection to the people in need across Minnesota. They are the people who are working within the same communities that the people who need help live in. So we also work with private and community-run organizations and independent service providers who deliver human services in Minnesota. So it is a very distributed model. Returning to the 10 domains, I've made a couple of changes to illustrate those contexts. Here, this one used to say products and services. Remembering that the scope of the architecture is the scope of the business, this domain can be scoped appropriately to human services for the work we do. Our reason for being as an organization is to ensure that all Minnesotans have access to human services that help people get their basic needs met. And if you think of us as a conventional business, those affordable healthcare, substance abuse interventions, etc., those would be the products that we offer to our customers, which are Minnesotans in need. And most of the people who are receiving those human services are not getting them from the Department of Human Services itself. So the organization domain that we cover from the Department of Human Services is not limited to our department itself, but extends to every employing organization and independent provider in the state of Minnesota. Most importantly, the local service agencies that are our direct connection with people where they live. So does that make everything that happens at each of those external business units in scope for our architecture? No, which was a relief to me. And the domains that we're going to be covering more in depth, capability and value, will help clarify what is and is not in scope. Capabilities are the building blocks of a business. The domain of capability represents the basic building blocks of any organization, all the things it's able to do, split down to their smallest parts. Capabilities can be used, improved, rearranged, and combined in a variety of ways to achieve an infinite range of business objectives. So what are capabilities? They are the things an organization is able to do. The Open Group, which maintains the TOGAF Enterprise Architecture Framework, has an even more generic definition: capability and ability to do something. This quote by Ulrich Hohmann, who's a thought leader for some time in architecture, I think at Microsoft. A business capability is a particular ability or capacity that a business may possess or exchange to achieve a specific purpose or outcome. So that gets back to the question of an ability that an organization doesn't possess internally, but contracts out or otherwise delegates to an external party, is still a capability and should be included in their map. Critically, a capability defines what a business does without attempting to explain how, why, or where the business uses the capability. We separate the concern of what we do from who does it within the organization and from how the organization achieves value from that activity. Those are captured in separate domains outside of capability, and we can cross-map those domains to each other to answer those questions. The capability domain itself remains at a level of abstraction that covers all possible cases, recording what we are able to do at the atomic or unsplittable level, down to a single noun and a single action apiece. That ensures that capabilities are relatively stable over time while the world that we're operating in changes rapidly. So an organization that's been around for 100 years will often have the same capabilities in most part that it did a century ago. For instance, 100 years ago, we needed to be able to identify customers. The customer identification ability to find and recognize a customer. Pop in the chat if you can think about how would that have possibly been done 100 years ago versus today?
Or pop it into the Q&A.
Oh, the chat Q&A, beg your pardon. I don't know if,
Can you
sorry,
ask your question again, Kit?
so thinking about the ability to find and recognize a customer. Let's put ourselves in the headspace of an organization operating 100 years ago. How might they have accomplished this capability then? I can't speak to how popular telegraphs were at the time, but if they had thought about how they used technology to accomplish something, they might have put that in there, and that would not be stable over time. Okay, we've got some going door to door, word of mouth versus web inquiry now. Someone else says through social networks.
You might put a sign up on a telephone post.
And also just personal recognition, the ability to look at a room full of people, find someone you recognize, and identify who they are. As the scale of business has grown over the past 100 years, and the way that we operate has changed, now we are as likely to use of somebody's fingerprint on their phone to recognize who they are. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish is the same thing. We want to be able to identify our customers. Same thing with financial account access management. How do you think that would have been done 100 years ago? And how do you think it's done today? How much has that one changed? 100 years ago, yeah, we had a lot more money in banks locked up. And we had a lot less biometrics to determine whether you're authorized to access an account. We didn't worry about scrambling information to send over the web, but we did still need the ability to selectively limit the right to view, use, or modify a financial account. An organization's capabilities taken together cover the whole scope of what an organization can do, but aren't the same as the value that the organization provides. The value an organization creates is what it builds with these blocks. We'll get into the value domain more in October. For now, staying focused on capabilities, those building blocks, let's talk about how we can organize them, knowing that different parts of the organization are going to be using them to build different things. In this example, we can imagine using the same set of building blocks to build 4 different models: an airplane, a dump truck, and 2 other trucks that I'm not enough of a truck nerd to identify. But some of them are going to use blocks that are specialized to their model. Maybe no other model in the organization uses those blocks. At the same time, there are other more common pieces like wheels that all of those models are going to need. So how can we organize all of the things that we need to build the different values of an organization without adding complexity by including some things more than once? If there's one thing that I've learned as I've practiced this discipline over time, it's that if you can do something simply rather than having additional complication, it makes life easier down the road. Because every time we add another level of complexity, in this case, I'm thinking back to when I worked in grocery and we had products that were sometimes in 2 places. And that increased the likelihood of one of them being out of stock while there was product in the back stock by some factor, significant. The same is true of capabilities. If it's distributed throughout the organization without good transparency to that fact, different schools of thought about how they work will come up organically over time, and the organization will build itself further apart, creating more rigid silos. So one of the benefits of a capability map is that it sorts all of an organization's abilities once and only once. On the screen now is a slightly out of date overview of the level 1 capabilities at the Department of Human Services. If you remember back to those 4 core domains of the 10 domain framework that we're using, recall that an organization uses information to perform capabilities that deliver value. The core domain of information has a close connection with capability and with this view. Each level 1 capability is based on a primary information concept or a noun, the big picture archetypal nouns in play at our organization. If we've done that well, a person should be able to map any object, person, or concept like strategy or team to one of these archetypal concepts at play in the organization. The information map lists types of each of these concepts, which helps people from different parts of the organization see themselves in it. For instance, a participant might be called a client, a recipient, a beneficiary, or an obligor, a non-custodial parent, or a patient by different people doing different things or working with different programs in different parts of our organization. We've worked to understand what all of those perspectives have in common to create a kind of Rosetta Stone for the enterprise. And that gives us the big buckets to start sorting all of our capabilities into, so that no matter what you're trying to build, you can find what you're needing to use. So getting a little bit more into how these capabilities are structured. I called it atomic before. We've taken it down to the smallest complete thought, a noun and an action. So in this case, participant identification. A participant, the noun, is defined in the information map as a person who is, has been, or might become a recipient or beneficiary of the organization's products and services. The action, the ability to identify, to find and recognize, gives us the identification part of the capability. Put together, participant identification pulls the definition from the information map, and we wind up with the ability to find and recognize a participant. Capabilities break down into more capabilities. Here's a slightly truncated overview of the request management capability tree from our capability map. Notice how we've organized many different actions that we can take with a request into a single business object-oriented view. When I say business object-oriented, I'm referring back to the fact that all of these are about a request. They're not talking about why we might be using the request, about how we're doing the request. We can map those to the things that describe those aspects. But here we're getting really specific about just what we can do with and to requests. Some hallmarks of the business object approach that's fundamental to the 10 domain framework and the meta model that powers it. Up here we have definition. So in an organization, somebody has the ability to establish a new business object, and other people have the ability to identify when one already exists. One of the reasons that I really appreciate this approach to capabilities is that at DHS, one of our core problems is information management, because we have created different business objects sometimes to represent the same person. If someone has applied for one program, there's a system that powers that program that has a record of them in the format it needs. If they apply for a different program, there's a different system that supports that. And these technology silos have created a fragmented data environment where our ability to identify where we have records of the same participant across our ecosystem is challenging. Another hallmark is the matching capabilities. Since all of the all of these capabilities are organized around things, we want to be able to create relationships of them to each other. So when we get a request for benefits, we want to make sure that it gets to the right partner to process it. So we need to be able to match a request with the participant who is requesting it, and with the channel that we're using to send it, and with the partner who we intend to receive it. And then the last hallmark I want to point out here is the information management section in every capability tree in our map, because the ability to modify information about these business objects is done by capabilities with that in their name. So let's look at a real life example to start illustrating this a little bit. We know that capabilities modify information. Well, I guess I'm telling you that. Capabilities modify information, and they are specifically able to modify information about the business object that's in their name. So a capability can only act upon what they're organized under. A request management capability, even if the request it has contains participant information that a person submitted about themselves, the request management capability cannot modify that information. The request contains that information, but it's a container for it. And we can get that request to someone who has the capability of participant establishment so that they can check for a record of that person and create one if it doesn't exist, or look for differences between the records and update what's there. But the request management capability itself isn't going to touch that information, just get it to where it needs to go. Capabilities also use information, and this is more liberal. Capabilities often rely on other business objects or information about them to do their work. Looking to a real life example from a team that maintains our online application that covers all programs on our combined application form and childcare through minbenefits.gov. So we maintain that channel for the entire state, but DHS doesn't process the applications that come through it. So someone in Minnesota has used the MinBenefits site to submit a request for benefits. We will route that request to their local service agency, and we want to make sure it's the right one that we're routing it to. So the capability to reflect that ability lives in request management and would be request partner matching. What information does that capability need to use? So first, it needs to know enough about the person who submitted it to know what their local service agency is. It looks to the request to see what participant has been matched to it, and the request, and then the information about the participant. The request asked the person to submit right when they filled it in, right? It asks people to name their county and indicate whether they belong to a tribal nation. So the participant has entered that information, and the request can use that information to identify which partner this request should go to. Then it needs to look to that partner to see what token or metadata it should add to itself to flag it for that specific partner. So it also needs that information about partner identification. Finally, once it has those pieces of information, the request can now modify itself to add that information, that metadata tag, to flag it for the right partner, and then to change its own status from unmatched to matched. And now it's ready for the request routing capability to get it where it needs to go. I included location in here to illustrate the way of like owning a product in work. So the product team that owns and maintains that online application has noticed that there's a pretty high error rate for people getting wrong which county they live in, somewhere around 15%. So one of the items that they put on their backlog when they found that out was looking into the ability to add a location management capability so that if a person has included their address, we could use that information to match it to a county with more specificity. So that's a way that we may mature our ability to match a request with a partner over time. So one thing to take away from this is that capabilities don't happen in a vacuum. They are enabled. And there are 5 different pillars that enable any capability. People enable capabilities, whether they're the people in the organization, internal or external, sometimes even customers themselves. Like we saw in this last example, the person who had the ability to establish a request was the person who was making the request. The person with the ability to enter that participant information is themselves, about themselves. The process is the business process of how the work is done. We stripped that out when we defined the capabilities, not because it's not valuable, but because that lives here. That lets us organize all the different hows a capability looks like into the same overview. Technology also enables capabilities. These are all the tools that support a business process, whether it's hardware, software, systems, applications. Information is a critical enabler. The information that is needed for the work to be done and the information that is changed by the capabilities. And finally, in government, sometimes policy gets lumped in with information, but it's such a core part of our landscape that we pull it out separate because these are our funding model, the source of our authority, the source of our responsibility. When we say policy, we mean it in the broadest sense. It could be anything from federal regulations, state statutes, agency policies, or business logic. And when we map those enablers to a given capability, we can triangulate an instance, one example, one concrete example of where that abstract concept is in play at work in an organization. So looking at the one that we just talked about, the capability of request establishment, or the ability to declare a request. The people who enable that are the participants who fill out and submit those applications online, and the ISD product line workers who create the tool they use to do it. The process that we're looking at for this specific instance is the process of applying online for food assistance, cash support, childcare assistance, emergency assistance, and/or group housing. If somebody was applying in person or by mail, this enabler map would look different. So all of these enablers are kind of interdependent on each other to define a specific instance. And the technology and tools in use at this instance are the MN Benefits web app, the browser that it is reached through, the mobile or the computer that's hosting that browser, and the internet that it's relying on. The information or data that is enabling the capability are participant preferences, like what language would I like to see this application in? What county do I live in? And other information about themselves. And the combined application form that this online web app replaces. And the policy in play are program eligibility rules, data privacy laws and policy, and accessibility guidelines that we work to endeavor to make everything that government produces accessible to people in our state, regardless of their abilities. Then the request partner matching capability instance that we looked at, we can map out similarly. The people who are enabling that are, again, the participant themselves who are providing the information, the service agency worker who will receive it, and the ISD product line workers who are getting it from here to there. The process, same one we're looking at above, the process of applying online for that set of programs. The technology and tools, there's the web app again. Then there's Metabase data management, FileNet document management, and I think I ran out of room, I'm sorry, but then it moves on. Oh, no, actually, that would be a request routing capability. So I left it off for a reason. Good job, Kit. The information it needs, we talked about. It's participant information, local service agency identifiers, and request metadata, with the potential to start looking to location data to get more clear about where it needs to go. And the policy that it's looking to is program administration rules of who should process an application for any given person, the county or the tribal nation that serves them. So that gives us a real life illustration of the concepts in work and brings me to the end of the presentation. So anything that people would like to discuss further, or, oh, there's already here we go. So the first question I'm seeing in the chat is, does the Department of Human Services maintain a glossary or some other kind of repository to document the business objects and instances? Great question. We're working on it. There's one of the things that is a common experience I'm having is, yes, this is at work in a few places in the organization, and we're trying right now to coordinate those efforts so that we're mutually supporting each other and working towards the same end goal. The communications team that manages the public web is working on a controlled vocabulary that it can use to tag information on the public web for better access and indexing. We're working to see how much we can align that with the information map that we're developing for business architecture that is looking to identify what all those archetypal concepts are at play in the organization, and use that almost like the, if you've ever used the Joy of Cooking, there's the index in the back where you know that you want to find this chicken recipe and you don't know where to look for it, but you can look it up and it'll tell you where else to look, and then you get there. So it's this like accurate, not entirely friendly, but incredibly useful. And that's how I kind of think about our business architecture information map. We're coming up with terms that we can use to group a bunch of similar things under one archetype. And then there's also an endeavor going on our data strategy and architecture team to use more information scraping in our systems to learn more about how information is used and be able to map these concepts to the way that we're organizing all that information. So we are in the progress of developing a few different ways for a few different audiences. Whether we're talking to machines or people, a lot of the same information is needed. It just takes different art to communicate to one versus the other. And business architecture is kind of the path through that allows us to speak both to humans and in the semantic logic that machines need to work.
Other questions for Kit? So, all right. Well, thank you all for joining us today.